In my many travels, I've learned that the nuclear industry is unbelievably risk-averse. Safety culture is the culture. That's a good thing when you work with such energetic infrastructure. The emphasis on safety above all else is also surely exacerbated by what was, only until very recently, the worst PR record of any industry ever. Today, nuclear is finally looking up from what I've been told was a kind of informal, keep your head down, pay no attention to us policy. However, it's bringing with it a relic, a part of safety culture that is actually too safe to be practical, at a time when a new reactor seems to be commissioned every day. Nuclear scientists and engineers will say it to themselves in journals, they will whisper it to me off the record. What the public doesn't know is that the fundamental assumption of radiation safety, and therefore nuclear regulation, simply isn't true. And this lie is holding us back. The nuclear industry is in between a spicy rock and a hard place. Almost every single one of the scientists, engineers, and officials I've met agrees with what I'm about to say, but for professional and political reasons, they can't say it themselves. What's clear from reading all the reports and studies I'm about to summarize is that many in the nuclear space are desperately trying to get the word out to the public about something they see as painfully obvious, and obviously painful. I was drawn to nuclear for this very reason. The science and the technology was, to me, so clearly misunderstood and unfairly maligned that it called out to me for better science communication. So, in that same spirit of honest evaluation and education, I'm trying to get their word out, because I do believe this has harmed and continues to harm the public in increasingly important ways. I trust my friends in the nuclear industry to know the line that I'm walking. Linear no threshold is a model that correlates effective radiation dose in human tissue with incidence of cancer. It is linear, which means starting from zero dose, any amount of radiation received proportionately increases the rate of cancer development. Less at low doses, more at higher doses. It has no threshold, distinguishing it from other models that only begin the relationship above a certain threshold of dose. In nuclear regulation and radiation protection all over the world, linear no threshold is the law of the land. It, quote, was adopted by national and international advisory bodies in the 1950s and has guided radiation protection policies worldwide since then. It is the bedrock of both regulatory policy and a paradigm shared by an entire school of inquiry in radiation science. LNT is easy to understand. More radiation, more risk. It's also easy to put into regulatory practice. Since any radiation is harmful, make your technology or medical imaging device or power plant as atomically quiet as possible. Make any potential dose as low as reasonably achievable, or A.L.A.R.A. The simplicity of LNT and its corollary A.L.A.R.A. keep it the official policy of most nuclear regulatory bodies. This is despite the fact that, quote, few in the radiation science community endorse this LNT model of low-dose radiation effects. The foundational datasets for linear no threshold come from the only case we have of large populations of people getting hit with large doses of radiation, the atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And for the large doses the Japanese endured, LNT works. Cancer risk does increase linearly. However, what makes this model maybe the most controversial topic in all of nuclear is that the straight line was drawn for survivors of weapons of mass destruction. What about down here? For humans that weren't unlucky enough to be in Japan in 1945? For those of us with radon in our basements? Or those of us who get a CT scan, or travel on planes a lot, or live in a high-elevation city? What about low doses? Where's the data on that? Over the decades, LNT and A.L.A.R.A. have encouraged lower and lower recommended rates for both the nuclear industry and the public. Without knowing anything else, this doesn't seem like a problem. Governments and organizations around the world are learning more and more about the low levels of radiation that most people will experience and are adjusting regulations accordingly, right? Actually, no. This trend is not based on observed harms or biological realities, and this unscientific iteration has had devastating consequences. Radiation is natural and omnipresent. There's uranium, thorium, and their daughters in the ground. There's tritium in the water. Between 1 and 100 cosmic rays from space are passing through you every second. There's radioactive potassium-40 in every single one of your cells. When the Earth first formed, there was even more radiation than there is now, as elements with shorter half-lives had not yet decayed and the atmosphere had not yet gained its full protective thickness. Life on Earth had to evolve under this high radiative pressure. Tubiana et al. Put it simply, quote, "The life of aerobic organisms would have been impossible without defenses. Organisms on Earth developed in a bath of ionizing radiation and solar ultraviolet radiation, and evolved defenses and repair mechanisms to deal with this selective pressure. They had to. This fundamental fact of Earthling biology is incompatible with linear no threshold. If any amount of radiation is harmful, how could single-cell life arise under constant irradiation, especially when it was much higher 3 billion years ago? How could multicellular organisms with any appreciable lifespan, like you or me, survive such a carcinogenic environment? While LNT proponents will say correctly that low doses of radiation cause observable damage in your DNA is damaged even more by natural sources inside of your body, and it's repaired just fine in most cases, tens of thousands of times per day. The single biggest problem with LNT is that evolution and your body's natural repair mechanisms are completely ignored in every recommendation and regulation, which impractically and untenably skews radiation limits for the public and for the nuclear industry. Here's an example. Most of you will have seen a chart like this: recommended levels of radiation not to exceed per year or even per career or per lifetime. When I was first learning about radiation, this naturally made me think that its damage to the body is cumulative, and therefore there was some absolute limit on the amount of, say, walking around the low-dose areas of Chernobyl that I could do. Indeed, LNT fundamentally assumes that radiation dose and damage are cumulative. What else are we supposed to think when a limit is listed as per year or per lifetime? But if radiation damage is cumulative, how can millions of radiation therapy patients a year receive total doses that would be lethal many times over? Well, it's because those doses are given to a patient over days and weeks, not all at once, allowing healthy tissue to recover. We've done it this way for decades because doctors and scientists know that human cellular repair mechanisms can handle it. They've seen radiation damage not accumulate firsthand. If linear no threshold were true, radiation therapy wouldn't work. But it does, for millions of people all over the world every year. This isn't simply a disagreement between government agencies or a squabble between regulatory bodies. It's mutually exclusive. Either any dose is dangerous and cumulative, or radiation therapy works. Go ahead and ask any oncologist about the latter, if you want to. Radiation scientists do not hide their frustration with the obvious incompatibility here. Read the literature for even a moment, and you'll see LNT called anti-scientific, a myth. I will not hesitate to say that the LNT is the greatest scientific scandal of the 20th century. These are very loud words in a field that has been traditionally very quiet. Their confidence comes from the fact that not only do the data not support linear no threshold at low doses, they demonstrate the opposite, that radiation can be beneficial. But this is apparently a fact the public isn't ready for. Radiation is natural, but it's not distributed equally. Some places on Earth have more uranium and or thorium in the ground. Some places are higher in elevation and therefore closer to the cosmic rays from space. Linear no threshold should say then that people living in extremely high background radiation areas, like Colorado, India, China, Brazil, or Iran, should have higher rates of cancer. Instead, Dr. Jeffrey A. Siegel notes that, quote, in contrast to LNT-based predictions, several high background radiation areas have the same or lower cancer rates compared with nearby areas with lower background rates. In Ramsar, Iran, the annual dose from a radium-226-laden environment is 260 millisieverts per year. This is more than 5 times the annual dose limit for a nuclear industry worker in the United States, 40 times higher than the average annual dose in the United States from natural sources, and 260 times higher than the recommended artificial dose limit. So, if LNT is true, why isn't Ramsar, Iran absolutely crippled by cancer rates. Why aren't any, literally zero, of these locations proving the predictions of the model? And not just proving it, showing the opposite, that low doses of radiation can lower a population's cancer rate. Thousands of peer-reviewed publications disprove the LNT theory that harm is proportionate to radiation even at low exposures. Thousands isn't hyperbole. It's a mountain of evidence. Why don't we know as much about these studies as we do about the radiation limits on every chart you've ever seen, that they completely refute? It's because they counter the current regulatory stance the world over. This point begets belaboring. This is a graph of leukemia in the survivors of the Hiroshima bombing in 1945. It shows a reduction in cancer rates below a threshold dose. This graph shows the fate of the famous radium girls. 0 cancers in 2,383 cases below a threshold dose. Here is the survival of lymphosarcoma patients treated with enough radiation to cause radiation sickness. The therapeutic effect was similar to chemotherapy. This is cancer mortality for tuberculosis patients. It's lower if they were repeatedly imaged with low doses of radiation. Cancer mortality for residents evacuated from villages near the Mayak nuclear weapons facility incident. Lower for residents who were irradiated below a threshold. Lung cancer mortality versus radon levels in the United States, corrected for smoking. Lower the more radon there is. Survival of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma patients who had whole-body, low-dose radiation therapy versus those that did not. Cancer mortality for radiologists compared to doctors that did not work with radiation. Lower. Cancer in nuclear shipyard workers. Lower than those with 0 radiation dose. Additional cancers created in radiation therapy patients. Lower below a threshold dose. Cancers in residents of apartment buildings in Taiwan that were accidentally built with widespread cobalt-60 contamination. A reduction in cancer compared to the normal rate. Finally, solid cancer mortality in atomic bomb survivors, a dataset similar to the one that defines the predictions of linear no threshold. Cancer deaths lower than the general population below a threshold dose. Let me repeat that. The most up-to-date analysis of atomic bomb survivors shows that they developed and died from fewer cancers than those who did not receive any radiation at all. Fewer. This conclusion should sound completely crazy to you. But as former nuclear engineer for the state of Massachusetts Jim Muckerhide claimed, quote, "No evidence of adverse effects for human beings exists in hundreds of low, moderate, and even high radiation dose populations that in any way confirms the LNT premise." It makes perfect biological sense. Organisms on Earth evolved under a selective pressure from natural radiation, and so part of that evolution was developing defense mechanisms for it. If an animal, like you with this genetic legacy, is exposed to radiation above normal, therefore, it makes sense that those defense mechanisms in the immune system all the way down to your DNA might kick into gear, reducing and maybe even reversing damage to the body. Radiation actually preventing harmful outcomes, like we saw in every one of the studies we just went through, is the concept of radiation hormesis. Hormesis describes beneficial health effects from low-level radiation below a threshold. It's most famously associated with Dr. T.D. Luckey, Professor Emeritus of the University of Missouri School of Medicine, who has collected over 2,000 papers demonstrating the effect. Today, an estimated 40% of applicable studies show hormesis in cell cultures in live animals. Indeed, the studies we showed earlier don't just refute linear no threshold, they support radiation hormesis. Lower cancer rates in all cases. Again, this makes sense if biological repair mechanisms are acknowledged. It's not dissimilar from any medicine that can be beneficial at low doses but dangerous at high doses. No doctor would say that because you can overdose on aspirin, it's too dangerous to take for your headache. Radiation hormesis is not just cancer. Studies also show beneficial effects like increased lifespans below a threshold dose. Jim Muckerhide again explains that, quote, "In 1963, the Atomic Energy Commission repeatedly confirmed lower mortality in guinea pigs, rats, and mice irradiated at low dose. In 1964, the cows exposed to about 150 rads after the Trinity bomb in 1946 were all quietly euthanized because of extreme old age. Hormesis is even more controversial than linear no threshold, but it's still an important piece of the puzzle. To me, it feels like if any regulatory body is going to make a change, they will acknowledge a threshold-based model before going all the way over to hormesis. This threshold that we've been alluding to this whole time is very well established. Among humans, there is no evidence of a carcinogenic effect for acute irradiation at doses less than 100 millisieverts and for protracted irradiation at doses less than 500 millisieverts. An acute dose of 100 millisieverts is the single most reference number you will see for the point at which doses start to slightly increase lifetime cancer risk. Even the brilliant XKCD will highlight it. But just like all similar charts, if this threshold is applied with a linear no-threshold context, this is meant to be a yearly cumulative limit. And so with 100 millisieverts and a healthy safety factor in mind, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission recommends an annual dose for the public of 1 millisievert per year, excluding background radiation and medical diagnostics. This is the hourly recommended rate we get if we average out this dose of 1 millisievert over an entire year without acknowledging biological repair mechanisms. This is the same average rate right now in Ramsar. It's 270 times higher. 36,000 people live long lives with zero radiation-induced effects in Iran, where the yearly doses are higher than that on the surface of Mars. If LNT is true, how can we ignore background radiation differences this large? Differences that push beyond a safe dose, if damage is in fact cumulative. Well, in 1960, that wasn't the National Council on Radiation Protection's problem. An abdomen CT scan can deliver 10 times the effective dose in seconds that you shouldn't get in an entire year, and that's just excluded? Should you get that test your doctor recommended or not? If you take the established 100 millisievert threshold dose and discard LNT for the reality of biological repair that starts within hours and continues for months, everything makes a lot more sense. Dr. Robert Hargraves notices that intensive radiation doses of 100 millisieverts have a 100% safety record. A dose rate safety limit of 100 microsieverts per hour would be more scientifically defensible. The very first radiation standards were similarly higher. 80 microsieverts per hour was first suggested in 1934, and quote, "No one has been identifiably injured by radiation while working within the first numerical standard set by the NCRP." These numbers themselves are less important than the fact that they can be orders of magnitude higher than current recommendations, making the low doses of radiation most of us experience every day far less scary and more understandable. I can honestly tell you that poring over this data has completely changed how I reflect on the rates I experienced in Chernobyl and Fukushima. I would view them entirely differently today, and I would change the tone of my videos if I was making them now. Given the significant amount of evidence in support of higher radiation limits and hormesis, Dr. Lucky even supported the idea that you could in fact be radiation deficient, that you could actually need more radiation in your life, not less. But even setting aside this more bombastic claim, it seems very clear from everything we've gone through so far that, quote, "The LNT fails at every level: molecular, cellular, microorganism, animal, and human." I will admit that I've fallen for these failures. In our Half-Life history about Eben Byers and the Radium Girls, I unnecessarily focused on their eye-catching, gruesome fates. I was parroting most media that gives the impression that every Radium Girl either got cancer or otherwise died horribly, but that wasn't even close to the case. In fact, out of over 2,300 cases of radium dial painters studied, there were only 96 cancers identified. That's, of course, 96 too many. And this was indeed a tragedy of workplace conditions and safety regulations that needed to be told. But that number is still just 4%. What I could have said is that despite the significant body burden of thousands of Radium Girls, the vast majority of them, 96%, had no health effects at all. And as we saw, there were 0 cases of cancer below a threshold dose. I also made it seem like Eben Byers, the famous socialite who ingested an impressive amount of the radioactive drink Radithor, died from terrible acute radiation syndrome, when, again James Muckerhide points out, quote, The truth is that Byers did not die of cancer. Byers had been the victim of the equivalent of a drug overdose. Byers was poisoned by ingesting a large amount of a heavy metal, radium, and apparently didn't die from radiation-induced cancer. I could have framed this by acknowledging Byers' unfortunate fate while emphasizing that literally thousands upon thousands of other Radithor customers who drank more moderate amounts, including the inventor himself, did not have any health effects similar to Byers. These changes in framing would have made the body's ability to adapt to radiation more impressive than depressing. I'm humbly asking you to forgive me for playing into the fear and misinformation that linear no-threshold-like thinking creates. And I know I'm being dramatic, but misguided fear of radiation can and already has had terrible consequences. We don't need to go through thousands of studies to show you that overly strict and biologically unfounded radiation regulations have harmed more than they've helped. We only need 2 statistics. On March 11, 2011, a combined earthquake and tsunami devastated the east coast of Japan, causing the single greatest one-day loss of life since the bombs were dropped in 1945. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant then melted down 3 separate times, belching a plume of fission products that soon rained down throughout the Fukushima prefecture. Because the rates were well above what LNT considers safe, 160,000 people were evacuated and stayed evacuated to varying degrees for over a decade. It is now estimated that over 2,300 people died as a result of this displacement. According to Japan's own reporting, the evacuation of Fukushima was not justified. You can watch that full story here. Chernobyl is the place where linear no-threshold should prove itself. The exclusion zone put up in 1986 should have saved lives. LNT's recommendations across Europe should have quelled fears. That's what the model is for. Instead, we know today that Chernobyl was not a cancer catastrophe. It was a meltdown of mental health. Quote, "The Chernobyl accident showed that overestimating radiation risks could be more detrimental than underestimating them. Misinformation partially led to traumatic evacuations of about 200,000 individuals and an estimated 1,250 suicides. This is more than 10 times the high-end estimates for the number of excess thyroid cancers correlated with the disaster. And it got so much worse." In the months following the explosion in Ukraine, pregnant women across Europe, thinking that any amount of radiation is mutagenic, chose to save an entire generation of children with between 100,000 and 200,000 elective abortions. There is no fact that I know in this space that is as simultaneously heartbreaking and infuriating. The radiation rates that cause this panic do look terrifying on a map like this, if you don't know what you're looking at. Finland looks like it had something to worry about, right? Inside that scary orange blob of cesium-137? It's only scary if you don't know that the rate indicated is less than the background radiation rate in Finland. This communication can only cause fear if you assume that any radiation is harmful, that linear no-threshold is true. But we know it can't be. If we took this map and corrected its color scale so that only radiation rates above established threshold doses were shown, the colors on this map today would look a little different. Like this. What those mothers wouldn't have given for this image. There's one more lie about Chernobyl that deserves to be destroyed. Because linear no-threshold extrapolates known cancer relationships at high doses all the way down to 0 dose, it calculates increases in cancer at low doses even if they would be too infrequent or literally impossible to observe. This extrapolation is called the collective dose, something that regulatory bodies actively use as a metric for risk. Dr. Robert Hargraves gives the example that, quote, "Regulators' LNT model predicts a worker legally exposed to 0.05 sieverts would have a 0.5% excess chance of cancer. Thus, by LNT proportionality, 1,000 so exposed workers would have 5 excess cancers. This 50 millisievert calculation ignores established 100 millisievert threshold doses and slaps a risk on it anyway. And if you apply this extrapolated risk to enough people, you will get, by simple math, some scary-looking numbers. But of course, a large dose to members of a small group is not equivalent to a small dose to members of a large group, even if the collective dose is the same. Using collective dose for radiation regulation is the same as saying something like this. The lethal median dose per kilogram for the caffeine in your coffee is 192 milligrams per kilogram. A 72-kilogram person would therefore have to have 138 cups of coffee to have a 50% chance of dying from caffeine toxicity. But that also means, linearly speaking, a 0.4 chance of dying per cup of coffee, right? And since over 1 billion people drink at least 1 cup of coffee every day, we should expect something like 4.8 million caffeine overdoses every single day. This is obviously ridiculous, but it's exactly how you get the ridiculous estimates for fatal cancers in Chernobyl's liquidators. Up to 60,000 deaths among liquidators based on collective dose? That signal should have been pretty strong among the low-dose noise, shouldn't it? When you don't extrapolate with collective dose and instead do an analysis like this one that actually examined and studied 67,568 emergency workers who worked in the Chernobyl exclusion zone between 1986 and 1987, you find, quote, no increase in the mortality from all cancers among the emergency workers as compared to the baseline mortality in Russian men. In fact, like the studies of the apartments in Taiwan, nuclear shipyard workers, and atomic bomb survivors, Chernobyl's long-term recovery workers seem to have a lower overall cancer and mortality rate compared to the average Russian male. I'll repeat that. Lower cancer mortality if you worked sensibly at an exploded nuclear reactor in 1986. The huge discrepancy here, the fact that you can find Chernobyl statistics that say both less than 150 total deaths from thyroid cancer and acute radiation syndrome, and greater than 100,000 deaths from continent-wide fallout, means that there has to be something wrong with the model that you're using. And that model is linear no threshold. It's time for those of us who care about nuclear technologies to tell the truth. The bedrock of nuclear regulatory policy is a ruinous anti-scientific stasis. It is refuted by published epidemiology and radiation biology. It is not a practical basis for formulating radiation protection standards. It is empirically false. No convincing epidemiologic data support the LNT relationship. Instead, quote, regulators should abandon cumulative year-long dose limits and instead set dose rate limits consistent with biological repair times. Credit where credit is due. The current United States administration recently gave some nuclear-related executive orders that call out linear no threshold directly. They rightly identify, in my mind, that such regulations hinder the U.S.'s ability to compete in the nuclear industry and on the world stage. LNT and A.L.A.R.A cost time, money, and political advantage. It would be much easier to get more reactors up and running for carbon-free energy if radiation limits came more in line with biological realities. For now, observers of the industry are cautiously optimistic about these executive orders, whether they agree politically or not. But for others like state nuclear engineer Jim Muckerhide, the orders don't go far enough. They don't recognize that this is about scientific truth, not just saving on construction costs. Before he died, he wanted to get it all out in the open. The LNT hypothesis is a fiction, maintained by a closed, biased interest group at massive cost to the taxpayers, electric ratepayers, and medically insured public. Hundreds of billions of dollars are now being uselessly expended solely on the basis of LNT-justified radiation protection policies, while the public is misled to believe that these expenditures are protecting public health. Misled no longer. Until next time.